everybody, I'm Kestra Pingree, fantasy author. I'm currently editing the second book in From Blood to Ashes. And this is the longest part of the writing process for me, and I think it's the longest part of the writing process for any author or writer, because writing is a lot of rewriting. My first draft is usually pretty solid in terms of the actual bone structure of a story. But the language, I usually change it quite a bit, specifically sentence structure and word choice, especially these days. When I first started writing, I didn't do this as much. I don't think I had the skills to. Writing is an ongoing process where you keep learning and it never ends. You can write 10, 20, 30 books and you'll still be learning. I guarantee it. Today I wanted to compare and contrast some of my first draft work to my final draft, just so you can kind of see all the work that goes into that. Specifically with Vampire Captives, since I'm working on the second book in From Blood to Ashes, and Vampire Captives is the first. Likewise, this whole video is going to be screen capture because I figure I'm going to throw up a bunch of text on the video so you can read along with me. So the way I usually write my first drafts, just really basically, is I like to outline my story before I even start writing, or I can't write very quickly because I have no idea where I'm going. That doesn't mean I need to have an intense outline, even though I've had some really detailed ones in the past. Vampire Captives had a rather detailed one, but a lot changed in the revision stage, so I decided I wanted to go back to doing a few sentences per chapter in my outline. And that works out well enough too, because that's what I did for Primal Magic, and it was faster. I'm all about speed and efficiency if I can help it. And then after that, the way I get through a first draft is by sprinting. So I'll set a timer for 20 minutes, and then I'll type as many words as I can. And so that's what you are reading from my first draft. I work by scenes, not chapters, so I put chapters together after the first draft, but let's look at the scene that became Chapter 1 of Vampire Captives. The Shang general snarled at me, and spittle dripped down his chin. That was the first line that I came up with in the first draft, because I wasn't so worried about having a perfect first line, I was just worried about getting the story down on the page. See here in the final draft, the first line is, "Werewolves were vampires' worst enemy." So the reason I thought this was a better first line when I went through and started editing was because it sets up the genre, everything, pretty darn well, I think. And then I did keep my line of, "The Shang general snarled at me and spittle dripped down his soaked muzzle." Except obviously you see there's a change there as well, muzzle instead of chin. In the first draft, I had the werewolf in his human-like form, and in the second draft, I wanted to put him in his wolf-like form. And that wasn't even intentional because I knew all along that I wanted the werewolf in his wolf-like form, because how my werewolves work is they have a certain amount of moonlight that they carry from each full moon to the next, and that's their source of power, the way they can shift their strength. And if they run out of moonlight, they're pretty useless. So I wanted to show that in this battle. And later on in my first draft, I act as if the werewolf has been in his wolf-like form the entire time because I made that decision in my brain. I was like, no, I don't want this werewolf in his human form. What was I doing? And that's kind of how my first draft will work. I'll just change things without going back to change anything because I'm not thinking about editing at all in the first draft. And if it works out, then I'll continue on that way. And if I don't feel it's working out, then obviously I'll try something else. And if I really hit a snag, where the story isn't working, I'll go back and look at my outline. Another thing I do in first drafts, if I'm not going to go ahead and do what I just said, pretend like something's been a thing all along, I'll leave myself notes in bright red. What were you thinking here? So in my first note, on my first draft of Vampire Captives in the same scene, I told myself I should probably talk about the vampire's vision. I wanted it so my vampires could see heat signatures as well as anything else. So I made a note to myself to include that. So let's read the first paragraph of substance. The first draft is, "The Shang general snarled at me and spittle dripped down his chin. This werewolf was gigantic, his shoulders sitting a couple feet higher than the top of my head. I circled him slowly as he watched my every move with eyes burning moonlight blue. He had killed many this fight. His once gray coat was matted with rust-colored dried blood and deep red new blood. In the first paragraph, including the first line of the final draft, werewolves were vampires' worst enemy. The Shang general snarled at me, and spittle dripped down his soaked muzzle. I circled him slowly, noting the corpses at my feet so I wouldn't trip as he watched my every move with eyes glowing blue. The wisps of moonlight dancing around his body were like unpredictable flames. Though they didn't burn, he would be formidable. I just wanted to interject for a minute and say that if you've listened to my video where I'm reading the first chapter of Vampire Captives, the first few paragraphs have been edited once again a little bit because I used moonlight a lot of times for some reason in my original final draft. And I don't normally suggest you do this because anytime you make changes to a manuscript after you finish it, you're probably going to introduce more errors than you fix. But since it was just like a few paragraphs of this issue and it was right at the beginning of my book, I wanted to go ahead and fix that because the first part of your book is the thing, everyone's going to judge it by. And yes, you see, we all make mistakes even at the end there. But I still feel really solid about how I wrote this book, and now I feel even better that I fixed that error. I'm not really sure why I made that error in the first place. It was probably me overcompensating for making sure readers understood the magic system. That's a good example of how we're all human. So as you can see, what I was just saying about adding description and making sure readers understand, that's what pretty much happens with me in my first drafts. Some writers are what they call overwriters, and their first drafts have a lot of unnecessary extraneous details, whatever. I usually have very little detail, so my editing process typically adds quite a few words, which is frustrating because I was hoping Primal Magic would be pretty much the same size book as Vampire Captives, which was about 70,000 words. But it's looking like it's going to be 80,000 to 90,000 words because my first draft finished at 70,000 words. And knowing me, I usually add like 10 to 20,000 words to the book. My first drafts are scarce, and especially in a fantasy, I feel it's important, that a reader can see the world they're in. I'm not talking about huge sweeping descriptions because I'm not into that kind of storytelling, but you'll have to tell me what you think of genre conventions. I've been reading some contemporary romance lately, and they're pretty light on the details as a whole. Anyway, let's go on to the second paragraph, excluding the first line in the final draft. First draft. I've never had the honor of taking down a Shang general on my own, I said, and adjusted my hold on my asu. Their curved blades glinted in the werewolf's moonlight as he powered up, tendrils of the substance coiling around him. And then the second paragraph in the final draft. He had killed many this battle, shown by the rust color of dried blood and the deep red of new blood matting his once gray fur coat. His mouth was so red one could have assumed his jaw had been sliced, but none of that blood was his. The smell of it was borderline rotten, with a savory undertone, vampire blood. I had no idea how much moonlight he had, but he was gigantic, meaning he had to have a fair amount to maintain the size. From his withers, he stood a couple of feet higher than the top of my head. So I basically added that entire paragraph because the third paragraph in the final draft is, I've never had the honor of taking down a Shang general on my own, I said, and adjusted my hold on my asu. Their curved blades glinted in the werewolf's moonlight as he powered up. Rippling tendrils blazed brighter and coiled around him as if to burst. I slowed down the battle a little bit because Lisette, my main character and the perspective character in this chapter, is kind of having a stare down with that werewolf at the beginning, and that helps the reader orient themselves a little bit more. As you can see throughout my scene in my first draft, I have a lot of those little red notes everywhere. And a lot of this stuff will be, if my scene's getting pretty long, because I usually like to keep a scene around 2,000 words, I'll leave notes like maybe cut the scene here. And I've got some other notes that I'm telling myself to check description. So I have another series in this world, so I need to make sure I'm consistent with the technology and stuff they use. This is a different kingdom, so things are different, but there are also more things that are similar than not. And consistency is important, obviously. We're talking about description in the way that you've probably read a book where a character's hair was blonde and then it's suddenly like brown on another page. I have. And I feel like that really takes the reader out of a book. I do my best to make sure that never happens, and obviously that's why we have copy editing and all the different rounds of editing, but copy editing especially, and line editing, I would argue. But even then, some things slip through. So that's been one of the hardest parts about being a writer for me. I'm a perfectionist and I really try to do my best. And it irritates me that, I'll find typos in my books no matter what I do. But that's just part of being human. The editor, whoever, isn't going to catch every error because we're all human. But you can do your best. And that's really all you can ask of yourself. Some people would argue that being an indie author is nice that way because then you can change your manuscript after the fact. Whereas if you're traditionally published, it's kind of hard to get a recall on a bunch of books that have already been printed. See here, this note, I tell myself to check if I had vampires turned to dust by the sun in The Lost Princes of Howling Sky, which is the other series in this world. That series was about the werewolves. I didn't have a ton of vampire-ness going on there. I did, but they weren't perspective characters, so obviously that changes quite a bit. In this series, From Blood to Ashes, I wanted to play with my vampires. So what ended up happening with this first scene in the first draft, I did end up splitting it into 2 scenes in the final draft. So going back to word counts, the first draft scene is 2,583 words. And then the first chapter in the second chapter, which is actually that same scene in the final draft, is 3,942 words. See what I mean? My books expand. I'll put up the first 2 chapters of my final draft and the first scene of my first draft, so you can look through them if you would like, because I think it would be too daunting to go through the entire thing on this video. But if you would like me to do something like that sometime, I wouldn't mind. But I just thought this would be a little introduction to see if anyone's interested. I'll have it on my website, so enjoy. I'll link to that below. I'll also link to the book below if you're interested in reading the entire thing. And along with that, if you have any questions about my writing process, if you're a reader or a writer, whatever the case may be, tell me what you're interested in seeing, and I will happily make more videos. Remember to subscribe, like, ring the bell if you would like to see more of me, and I'll be back next week with another video.